Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Unifying Content and Data to Simplify a Complex Learning Environment, with David Wentworth, Principal HCM Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and TJ Seabrooks, CEO of Rustici Software. TJ Seabrooks is the CEO of Rustici Software, the world's leading e-learning technology experts that help organizations and technology providers implement and maintain e-learning standards in their platforms and products. TJ is influential in the evolution of e-learning standards. He played an integral role in the contribution to two broad agency announcements awarded to Rustici by Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative and has been a key contributor to the XAPI specification since 2012. TJ has an MS in Computer Science from Vanderbilt University and a BS in Computer Science from Mount Vernon Nazarene University. I would like to extend a thank you to Rustici for sponsoring today's webinar. Rustici Software helps companies in the e-learning space work well together. As the world's leading standards experts, they provide the tools and knowledge to help companies create, distribute, manage, and play e-learning compliant content. Since 2002, Rustici has assisted hundreds of e-learning software vendors, organizations, and government agencies conform to specifications like SCORM, XAPI, CMI5, and AICC. Rustici Software is part of Learning Technologies Group. I wanted to also share a little bit about Brandon Hall Group. Brandon Hall Group is a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Our vision is to inspire a better workplace experience. We have world-class research, data, and expertise all across areas in human capital management. Currently, we have open surveys in HCM Outlook, talent risks, wellness and well-being, learning strategy, and many others. We would love to hear from you. In exchange, you can receive free research, reports, and more. To participate, please visit our website, www.brandonhall.com, and click on Open Surveys. And finally, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. The playback will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the questions box for our presenters. If you'd like to download a copy of our presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section. And now let's turn it over to our presenters so we can get started.
Great, thanks, Danny. I'd like to welcome everybody today and also extend my own thanks to Rustici and TJ for joining us today. I do encourage everyone to take advantage of the question box there. Feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll keep an eye on those and try to answer them in real time when they're relevant. And we'll also have a little bit of time at the end to catch up with anything we may have missed or any new questions that come in. So if you want to communicate with us at all, go ahead and use that question box to do so. We appreciate that. So TJ and I are here today because we're talking about how do we make sense of today's complex learning environment? And that's one thing that's truly becoming clear to me anyway, as I go through the research and talk to organizations as we move forward with sort of the more modern learning environment, and we talk about creating these new learner experiences where on the one hand we're trying to make learning as seamless and as effortless for the learner as possible. What we're finding is that companies are encountering quite a bit of complexity on their side, on the back end of it, as they put it all together. So it's clear that there's a lot of moving parts to, at least when in our research, when we look at what makes an effective learning environment, there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things to manage, keep track of from a lot of different areas. And so we're going to talk about those as we move through today. But the first thing I wanted to do was just check with folks on the line. And let's just ask, how many different types of learning tools and platforms do you currently have in your own learning environment? So maybe you don't have any yet, and you're here today trying to find out maybe what's ahead of you. Maybe you've just got a handful or even one platform you use, but we do know organizations that have quite a few. And we're talking, anything from an LMS to an LXP to a learning content management system, any sort of standalone video platform, anything like that. So just an idea of what people are dealing with in their own organizations. And as people are voting on this, we'll give it a few minutes. We've got a pretty good response. We'll give it a couple more seconds. TJ, I wanted to ask you your thoughts when you work with clients and they come to you and you start to discuss their challenges. What do you see in environments from like the number of different platforms that are typically in play?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brandon, or David rather. So usually when people come to us, they're asking us really simple questions to start. They come in with these really well-defined problems, and after we start talking to them for a little bit, we sort of discover the size and complexity of their whole world. They tell us about the multiple systems they need to connect in, all the content they're purchasing, and we usually see organizations with 3, 4, 5 different systems in their organization across tools, content, LMSs, platforms. That's really what we expect, is that most of our customers are going to have 5 systems that they're trying to stitch together to be as effective as they can at training their employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see here from the results of our poll, a little bit more than half of people have anywhere from 1 to 4 in-house. But then you do see almost a third, 5 to 9, and even 13% with 10 plus. So not surprising there. We even had Vieco offered up that they've got 3 LMSs and they're piloting an LXP and a pilot of JAM as well. So, and lots of different content development tools. So, really when we start to think about what goes on in a learning environment, it's clear that it's pretty complex, and we need to really think about how we approach that. So moving through, one of the reasons why everything's becoming more complex on that front end for the people who are creating and administrating these environments is we're finding that people just need access to information, right? We found that in our research, companies feel that people should have access to various learning resources, either weekly, daily, or more often. Almost 2/3 of companies have said that. And so in order just to do their jobs correctly, they need to be in pretty frequent contact with learning resources, and just also think about the way people interact with the world around them. If they have a question, if they need a piece of knowledge, they'll search for it, right? They'll Google an answer, and they want to have information readily available at their fingertips. And so organizations are trying to create environments that help that happen. And so to sort of talk about those environments, let's take a look at, in our research, we found what goes into an effective learning environment. And so part of that is what we call this high impact learning. And some of you may have seen this from our research before. We looked at companies that say that they're having a positive impact on these various outcomes, things like time to productivity, employee engagement, individual performance, things like that. And we looked at them and tried to find out if their learning environments were different than other organizations. And so as we go through some of the data here in a little bit, we're not going to do that yet, but as we do that, keep that in mind that when I say high impact learning, that's what I'm talking about. We're talking about the types of environments that have an impact on these outcomes that you see here. So before we get into that though, let's talk a little bit about the overall learning ecosystem. And TJ, if you would, sort of walk us through like what a typical ecosystem looks like.
Yeah, so when we look at these typical learning ecosystems, we're seeing more and more that there are sort of multiple stratosphere that these ecosystems exist in. So what we're looking at here is really, inside an organization, that internal ecosystem. This is where the LMS that you log into, the LXP you're using as this, really one-stop portal to all of the things in your organization, the mobile app that your team built so that you can, more effectively reach people at that time of need. All of these pieces, the video platform that's a little different, these all exist inside the organization. We're going to collect that data, and that's where we all start to see those LRSs come into play.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we expand that ecosystem, we start looking at things like, well, our organization doesn't only train our own employees. We actually have customer support staff or training materials we make available to our customer support people. So now our learning environment really needs to capture people both in our organization and outside of our organization. And you also have things like clients. We have vendors. If we go forward one more level there, we're going to see this extended enterprise model start to show up, where you're not just training your customers and you're not just training your employees, you're actually training further down the supply line. You want to make sure that your sales partners know how to talk about your product, and you want to be able to make the same training material available to them and manage it like you do other things. But that's becoming increasingly more difficult because all of these other partners we see here outside of our central organization actually have their own learning systems. And that's one of the big hurdles that we're trying to get over through using LRSs and other sort of centralized systems.
Right. And thinking back to the poll question that we asked around, the different types of technology that are in-house to execute on all of this that TJ sort of walked us through, you can see from our research that, yes, it's pretty clear that there are a lot of tools in place. And again, going back to saying how the difference between high impact and low impact organizations, there's not a lot of daylight between the tools that these companies are using and whether or not they're finding that they're having an impact on outcomes. Although we do see some separation in areas like microlearning or having an LRS where you're able to track the different types of learning interactions that are going on. But what this basically is just showing is that beyond the LMS, which we see pretty pervasive throughout most organizations, there are a lot of other tools at play. So not only are we talking about the scope of that ecosystem as TJ walked through, like the things that it encompasses, but then what are the moving parts inside of it from a technology standpoint. So these are the different platforms that companies are using. But then we get into the different types, right? Let's see if we can call them modalities or the technologies that are used to actually deliver the learning. And here's where we start to see huge differences when we get into what makes an effective learning environment. Things like video, informal peer-to-peer learning, the micro-learning, on-the-job exercises, that mobile delivery, TJ pointed that out as part of that ecosystem in there, the apps that are being created. We can see here the percentages here are companies that say they use these items either often or always, right? So we just see that those high-impact companies are far more likely to be using these items either often or always than those companies that are not having as much of an impact. And then the last piece on that is the different formats that are available. Like when we look at content, right? We've talked about the actual scope of the learning environment, and then we are talking about the platforms and the modalities. The actual formats that the content exists in, there are so many different ones. Obviously, a lot of PowerPoint and then a lot of PDFs that are out there, ILT programs, videos, you got SCORM courses, various other e-learning modules. So there's a lot of different content to keep track of as well. So all of these layers add to the complexity, because you think about, if you extrapolate this out across that broadened extended enterprise that Jay was talking about, you can see the scale of what's being managed. And, a lot of times these things are being managed by different groups, different people, and it can be difficult to get them all dialed in together and working together. And then the last piece that I'll touch on from a content standpoint is this content is coming from a variety of places. If we look at these different content areas, things like ethics or technical skills or soft skills, and where they're being created, you can see here on the left, there's companies that are saying, well, we get that all from somewhere else. It's all third-party material. Either we're buying it or somebody else is creating it. And then as you move towards the right, it moves more in-house until you're all the way on the right, and the content is 100% in-house. So you see things like ethics training and some compliance training. A lot more of that stuff is being created in-house. But so then that adds yet another layer of complexity of what are the tools that are being used to create the content, how are we tracking the content that we're getting from other places, and how are we making sure that we're able to track and measure and capture all of the data in a cohesive way that crosses all of that, so we can make sense of what's going on, instead of having it in all these little disparate areas that on their own don't really tell you the true big picture of what's going on in learning and the impact it's having. So let's talk a little bit more, TJ, if you will, about the extended enterprise.
Yeah, so when we're looking at the extended enterprise and the way we tend to see this show up for folks, it's really this large sort of content need. They're serving many different audiences. So often that situation might be something where you're looking at the world and you've got a set of content you need to use internally to train your employees, to train your own sales staff. But you also have a channel partner, you have a franchisee, you might have product training that you want to get out into the world. And your biggest problem in that moment ends up being twofold. It's one, what kind of systems do these extended use cases have available to them? And then the sub bullet in that is really, what technologies do they have available? David, one of your slides a moment ago had the VR content that we're starting to see come out and how that percentage is breaking out. And I saw it's about 13% of the high impact training organizations. But when we think about the complexity of these learning ecosystems, and we start digging in, we're going to find that a lot of the folks on this webinar, and certainly a lot of the enterprises out there, have these learning ecosystems that weren't built for flexibility. And that's another type of complexity. So all of that goes into this idea that we're really trying to make all of our training available to as many people as we can, and trying to reduce all of the things that make them different. How do we make sure that this content works everywhere? How do we make sure that it's not a huge support burden for my staff to manage all of this content, as I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with? And then what do I do with the results for that? And how do I get content and results back from that franchisee that I sent this package out to know that their sales staff is as prepared as mine? Because I really have a vested interest in that franchisee's sales staff being as prepared as possible. And it's those types of problems that we see that all of these tools are starting to sort of enter the marketplace to solve for.
Absolutely. And, at this stage, there's a couple of points that came in from some of the data I was sharing, and Corey's curious about the difference between high impact and low impact. Basically, the high impact it has an impact on the outcomes that I shared. There was a list of outcomes, things like individual performance and employee engagement, and time to productivity, things like that. And these are companies that say that their learning approach is having a positive impact on those items. The low impact bars are those companies that don't say that they're having a positive impact on those items. And then the other question that came in was, it was more of a commentary from that, and it's saying that how looking at a list of modalities and how people are learning, in that, saying that adults learn by doing and activity, it's strange that game type learning is very low. And I would agree with you on that point. And I think the reason why we see it being so low is there's two things. One, it's not applicable in every single situation, right? We can't make a game or a simulation out of everything. But at the same time, there's also a pretty slow adoption on the corporate side from gamification of learning. We're seeing a bit of a pickup in it, but it's still in early stages from that. So that's probably why you see that.
And one of the things we see, David, there, when people reach out to us, we see a ton of people, they're excited about games, gamification, and they're all trying to get that data or that experience back into their LMS, back into the reports that they pass up the chain. And there aren't the tools in place that they need for that, and that's a real hurdle for them.
Absolutely.
Moving past that, and then we're going to have a little bit more of this data. And basically what I wanted to show here now is that one more layer of complexity, right? So, TJ was talking about making flexible, and as we try to create these new types of learning experiences, that creates a whole nother layer of complexity around, what are we actually offering? How are we tracking whether or not the learning is having an impact? Because now what we're looking at is, you can see here, these are the things that high impact companies are more likely to include in their learning programs. So methods to gather learner feedback, a way to reinforce the learning concepts or to practice and apply the knowledge, providing some sort of contextualization of the learning based on what the learner's needs are. These are all things that are driven one degree or another by data. And so where is this data coming from? How are we managing it? And what we're also seeing is these are the types of environments that no longer fit the traditional models of measuring hours of training or completion rates or even grades, because that's not what these things are about. These are learning environments that are focused on different kinds of outcomes, more performance and business-based outcomes rather than pure training outcomes. And so that requires a new mindset of, okay, what kind of data are we capturing? How are we measuring this stuff? And how are we pooling it all together? So as we talk about the data, what about the data? What are some of the things that we need to think about? So there's a lot of different types of data that we need to think about. There's the different types, right, of the data. And then where is it coming from, right? What are we using? And that's another challenge we see is oftentimes in learning, as we try to use data to measure learning and improve learning, a lot of times the learning function only has access to the data that it's generating. And even in those cases, they're not even sure where all of the data is or what they should be looking for. But as we expand out past the learning function, there's no idea where data is being captured, what data is being captured, how useful it is. Can you even get access to it? I mean, we see that in organizations, there's challenges there. And then, we did in our measurement study, we found that there isn't even a lot of confidence in the accuracy of data from different parts of the organization. So a lot of times learning isn't even inclined to go after the data because they don't think it's very valid or accurate. And so they don't want to use it in the analysis that they're running. But there are many different uses for the data, anywhere from just purely measuring the learning, whether or not it's the interaction itself within the learning or the outcomes that are being generated, or the data can be used to help fuel machine learning and AI to help with recommendations and things like that. And of course, there's the pure data analysis. But TJ, obviously, you guys are focused very heavily on data. That's kind of the key element here of XAPI. What are some of the other considerations or some of the real key things that companies are struggling with when it comes to data?
Yeah, and one of the huge problems people are seeing, and you actually referenced it in one of those slides you had, talking about where all of this data, where the content's coming from, and it's making data match up. One of the things we see a lot of in the current ecosystem is people talk about the data they can pull from this system, the CSV from this system. We're constantly helping people try to sort of make sense of data that comes from content they purchase from a third party that never works or behaves quite like the content they build in-house and things like that. And then you mentioned the outcomes data. One of the things that's been the most impactful about the move towards tools like XAPI, which push for this common format and language for talking about learning data, has been now we can go out to these external systems that are holding some of that outcome data. We can format it to match our learning data and put them in one system to make it easier to sort of compare and slice that data in one spot so that we can start helping these learning departments make a case for the impact they're having on the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really critical that companies really begin to get a strategy around these issues, around data, because that's the key element of data is it's definitely not going away, right? It's not like, say, some sort of new fad technology that might come and go. Data is what it is, and it just grows over time. And the importance of it is actually growing as we move into an era of machine learning and AI. As I mentioned, those things are powered by data, and they're only as smart as the data that we're putting into them. And so we have to make sure that as an organization, we have a good handle on the data before we start feeding it into these type of systems and start making decisions based on it. So this is a challenge that companies can't simply wait out. Need to get a strategy together and
That's
make
right.
a concerted effort to really dig into what your data strategy is. And that means everything from what data is important, where is it, who has access, how do we put it together, what tools are we using to manage the data, to analyze the data. And so that's one of the places where the reason why we're having this webinar is what XAPI is all about. The idea of, from a learning perspective, and all of these new different layers to the learning environment, it's designed to help pull all of that together. So let's talk a little bit about what XAPI really is and what it can do. So for those of you who are familiar, XAPI is a technical specification, like a standard, so we're used to hearing about SCORM. Now, it's not the same thing or a replacement of SCORM, but it is a standard that's used for the collection of data, and it makes it easier for systems to talk to one another about this data. It expands sort of what is contained within the data. So, whereas a SCORM standard might tell you, if something was opened or finished, XAPI can help you tell a lot more. And so what it'll help you do is be able to transfer those learning records from one system to another. We do a lot of technology selections, and one of the biggest issues in that process is okay, we've got all this data from our old system. We can't just throw it all away and start from scratch. It's important. So how do we get it from one place to the other? So the idea of an XAPI standard allows that data to move relatively seamlessly between one system and the other because it's understood by both systems at a much higher degree than other standards. And so it helps with that. It helps the LMS work with all these other technologies that we're talking about because they're all speaking the same language. And then just as a way to store and manage all of the records that you're collecting from what's going on with learning. And to sort of illustrate what that looks like, it's a simple illustration of this is what the traditional learning model is, right? So you've got your course, and the course is essentially a black box once it's created and pushed out. And so all we can really tell from that in traditional standards is we can tell who enrolled and who went into it. So who started it, people that have signed up for it, or people that we've pushed it out to. And then it'll tell us who finished. And it might actually tell us whether or not they got a passing grade if that's one of the elements that's included. But it still doesn't tell us what's going on inside that course. And so for years, companies have been making decisions about learning content based on just this information. So, well, it turns out not as many people are finishing it, or the people are getting poor scores. So let's scrap the entire program and start over and rebuild. Or, oh, people love this program and it's a 99% completion, so it must be a great program. Let's invest more in it. But the truth is, if we don't know what's going on inside of that course, you don't really know whether or not it's too easy, people are just skipping through it, or if they are getting hung up, what specifically are they getting hung up on? Maybe we can just address that one issue and not the entire program. So what XAPI does is open up that black box and show you what's going on inside that learning. And it doesn't have to be a course. It can be any sort of learning interaction. And that's the beauty of XAPI, is it allows you to capture whatever that activity may be. And so before we move on to anything else about that, if you have any more you want to say, TJ, about, because you guys are the experts about what XAPI is and does.
Yeah, so I'll just be brief here. I think that we could talk for hours and hours about XAPI if we had the space. One of the things I want to make sure people keep in mind as we look at XAPI, and you were sort of mentioning this as we talk through data and the data concerns, XAPI is going to be another type of data in our system. And it's one of the reasons as we work with customers who are beginning large learning ecosystem projects and they're bringing new systems in, we really encourage them to actually start working on the data side of their project like it's a full-on project. Do a requirements gathering phase. Gather all of the stakeholders that might care about that data. And it's more people than you expect. It's not just the people who are going to create the content who care what data you want to collect. It's the people you'll ask later to build reports. It's the folks who know what questions they need answered to make business decisions, so on and so forth. It's a developer of an application, because ultimately all of those people need to have some buy-in into whatever this data solution that you're going to come up with is. And that's going to be true in XAPI also. So that's always our encouragement, is to really focus on that data side up front. And that's going to be the same whether you're using XAPI or not, but we found it's even more true in the XAPI space.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point, is to think about these things up front. When we talk about measurement in general, that's the one thing we see time and time again in organizations, is that the actual measurement of learning seems to be the last piece of the puzzle, right? So they build the learning, they put it together, they roll it out, people take part in it, and then when it's all said and done, that's when the organization goes, okay, now let's measure it. But at that point, you don't know what you're measuring against. It's too late. And so the same thing with the data is, if you wait until everything's done and rolled out and then turn around and say, okay, what data was collected, then you've just sort of exacerbated the problem. The idea is to know what data is important from the outset. What are you after? What are you trying to generate? What questions are you trying to answer? And let's focus on those. And that way, you're not sifting through mountains of data that may be irrelevant or out of date or what have you. You're really focused on what it is you need. So, data is not just a byproduct. That's right. Of all of this. Yeah, it's not a byproduct, it's not an outcome, it's an integral piece of this. It's what's going to help you answer the questions that you're seeking. So it's important to have that strategy up front.
Yeah. And if you're one of those folks with 10 plus learning systems, all of those learning systems might not even support the same data types we're talking about, right? So there's just a lot of planning that needs to come into play there.
Right. I mean, think about just even outside of learning, think about a day at work where you've had to look at some kind of data. Maybe it's a couple of different spreadsheets from different people, and you've gotten one from one place and one from another, and they have relatively similar data, but none of that data lines up. The columns aren't labeled the same way. And so it's next to impossible to use both of those sets of data. So you're having to sort through them separately. The idea is to get everything working on a common language so that it's easier to use everything
Absolutely.
together. Yeah. And so what can we do with what the things that XAPI generates, the statements that are being generated and the tools that are available to us? Well, what we have seen from organizations is things like, high stakes simulations. So you're able to create, to generate far more insight into what people are doing in a learning environment like a simulation. So it's not just they launched the simulation, they got through it, and they performed the tasks. You can actually get down to a very granular level about what's happening in those simulations, how they're reacting, what choices they're making, which gives you great insight not only into the learner, but into the learning. You can see how those two things are working together. I mentioned a few times already, artificial intelligence. It's a big deal. For the sake of argument, we use artificial intelligence as a sort of a catch-all for things like machine learning, which is a little bit different. But the idea is that these algorithms need data in order to run and come up with results. And so that's we can use XAPI to feed this type of data into those kinds of systems, which then, of course, all of that kind of data will help you build things like recommendation engines, which are becoming a key element of learning. We've seen it, we showed in our research that recommendations and contextualization are a big piece of the modern learning environment. And if we don't know enough about learners, about how they interact with learning, about the content itself, and about the outcomes, we won't be able to make recommendations or customize or contextualize. Everything will just sort of be that sort of default generic flavor. And so the great thing about XAPI is we can generate much more granular data and statements that allow us to create that type of contextualization. And I think what we have now, TJ, is we've got an example of an organization you've worked with that's actually put some of these things in practice, just so people can get like an illustration of how this works.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've worked with a lot of customers, different projects, some pretty huge names, but what we found over and over again is that we have these organizations like Caterpillar who have a lot of different systems in their organization. They know they have the outcomes data somewhere, but they've never been able to get at it. They know that they need to be looking at this data in order to make decisions. They're trying to be a data-driven company. They know they have the data. They know they can save money and be more effective, and they're just trying to find the moment to go do it. So in the Caterpillar case, they were able to work with a company that we've worked with, a sister company of ours, Watershed, who uses XAPI as the underlying language to standardize the way we're going to talk about learning data. So they're going to use that language for capturing what a learner did inside a piece of content, letting them adapt that content. We always have these projects where we get the opportunity to ask the learning design folks, the people actually developing the content. We say, if you knew exactly what buttons inside that course a learner were clicking on, if you knew what slides they took learner a longer time on, what would you do differently? What would you be able to do if you had that information? And we use that as part of that project to guide that. And this is going to be a project where we're able to go and help them get that information they need to improve that content, adapt it for different audiences, make it more effective, and get different modalities of content all in one place so they can look at it. So if we go forward a slide here, David, we'll see here that with all of the extended workforce that they have available, so Caterpillar's largely driven on this large franchisee model, the way everyone else is. They have to train those folks. They know that these dealers need to be trained more effectively. They know they can generate more revenue if they do it, but they're also able to see, that some of these franchisees have really complex learning systems of their own. They don't actually look like the corporate learning system, and some of them have a really, not as sophisticated of a learning environment. So they have to use something like XAPI to sort of stitch together these different learning systems that are very different. They don't support the same modalities. They create data that looks different. And we're using XAPI as the layer in the middle to go modify that data and get it into that format that helps everyone. And then hopefully, in the watershed case, our hope is always that we're able to match that data about what learners did in the content with data from the outcomes so that we can find places where we can identify our best training and make that available to everyone. We can identify places where the training simply isn't doing what we expected it to do, and then we can go modify and improve those places. So as they worked through this project, one of the most interesting things was, that they were more easily able to add systems to this environment. So when we look at those 5 and 10 plus system organizations, or we look at things like VR, which, we talk to customers all the time and they're really excited about something like VR or a game, and they don't know how to tie it into their existing ecosystem. This is a place where moving to this really XAPI centric view of the world, where they're able to say, and we'll see a slide here soon that has a drawing of their environment, we're going to see that they're able to create this sort of single source of truth for reporting on XAPI data. And they're able to do all the work of tying these different data sources in via XAPI and not upsetting the existing ways in which their learners get to content and training and these various experiences, because they've taken most of the heavy lifting on the back end to get all that data into the one format that they're going to operate against. This is a pretty different structure than what we've seen over the previous, say, 15 years in the learning industry before we got here, where we had these really monolithic systems. We were making feature requests, we were getting them to add functionality, and these single systems got bigger and bigger, and they had more and more of our data. But a project like this Caterpillar project gives everyone more flexibility. It gives Caterpillar flexibility to potentially move to other LMSs because they have this centralized way in which they look at reporting data. It gives their franchisees and extended enterprise training facilities the ability to use whatever LMSs works for them, whatever technology and training works for them. And then we're able to go out and say, you know what, the best video platform, that's the one we want. The best way to handle VR, that's the thing we want. So instead of that monolithic application that we had in the past, and I can only imagine that everyone here has gone through some of these migrations. They take a couple years to switch systems and things like that. They're able to look at these really niche tools and replace one at a time as they find a better tool, as it gets upgraded, to make sure that they always have the best in that particular capability, because they've used XAPI to tie everything together. And I think on the next slide, David, we'll see a picture of what that environment looks like. So when we look at something like this, we're able to see all of the places where this centralized organization has put Watershed. In their case, that's their LRS that's going to be doing some of the learning analytics for them, helping them answer the questions that they've defined up front during that project process. But look at all the kinds of systems they're tying into this. Open Sesame as the place their learners go to launch from a large content library. They have assessments through Question Mark. They use Kaltura for video hosting. They went out and they got to procure and acquire different tools for each one of these things, but they were never locked into just one of these tools for reporting. They were never at a place where they said, well, the only way for us to compare our Question Mark assessments against how well people did watching videos. Did everyone who passed the assessment spend the entire time watching the video? They're exporting it, putting it in Excel spreadsheets. Now we have this single dashboard in an organization that's going to collect all of this data about assessments, videos, sales, service, and make it all available and help surface all of that for decision makers. And that's hugely valuable. This is the moment in the e-learning industry where we get to go out and help people make the business case for their department. I talk to a lot of people, David, and they say, well, we don't have quite as many resources as we would have liked, and we had trouble, with this. But once they get to the point where they're able to paint this picture for someone and give them a dashboard of all the meaningful metrics in the organization and tie it back to their training, it becomes a much more important part of the organization, and it becomes a really, really valued part of the organization.
Yeah, and I think this image here is powerful in that, Caterpillar isn't the biggest company in the world.
No.
I mean, they're not a mom and pop shop, but they're not the biggest company in the world. And you can see how complex their learning environment could be. I mean, it is if you look at it, but it's obviously simplified by the use of the tools that they have. But I would encourage organizations to undergo, if you haven't already, an exercise like this. Can you map out your environment and how things are supposed to work together and talk together? Because we know from our experience that a lot of these things, they're not all put into place at the same time, right? They all come in at different times, different people own them, and the overall interactivity and integration of these items, all these pieces, it sometimes isn't all the way thought out. So I think it's a great exercise to actually lay out, what does this environment look like? And it isn't a list of systems, it's actually a visual of what is the spider web of connections, and how important are those connections? Do these systems actually even need to talk to each other? And if they do, is it more important that these talk to each other than those? And so you can sort of get a level of, how do we put this together, and what do we need to make these things work together? Like I said, we've worked with a lot of organizations through this, and the shock sometimes of the exercise of, we had no idea of what we were sitting on top of until we actually sat down and did this.
Well, David, one of the things that's happening there is we have a lot of folks that don't know what systems in their organization are actually being used for training. So you have, if you went to an employee and said, if you had to answer this question, where would you go? And you asked 50 employees and you got 35 different answers. Some of them go directly to Google and the learning department never catches that information. Some of them know to look on the internal wiki. Others go look at an email from their boss from 2 years ago. So when we start looking at all the systems and we go and do that inventory of learning systems, some of the folks we've worked with have found that they have 2 or 3 different systems that are actually serving the same role. And there are efficiencies there if they can just do things like migrate the data out and into their core system and things like that. We really want to get to a place where people don't feel stuck with their decisions and they feel like they can go procure and use whatever tool is going to help them do their job as well as they can.
Right. And so that brings us back to the overall diagram of that learning ecosystem, and you sort of wanted to break it down for people a little bit.
Yeah, so the things that we would really want to call out here, and if you go ahead and blow out the rest of this ecosystem, is we have all of these places, and you see that in the Caterpillar chart, and you see it here, of systems that need to be able to talk to each other. And some of the connections aren't obvious, but they're the things that you need to do your job better. So I'll give you some of the examples that we've seen. We've seen a big move towards LCMSs, towards other solutions to help you centrally manage, version, and control all of your content so that you don't have to send it out into the world, so that you can reduce some of the complexity of managing that. We've seen this push towards the reporting dashboards like we see with the Watershed and the Caterpillar project, the LXPs, but all of these systems in your modern e-learning ecosystem, when you go through procurement, you've got to be asking about APIs. Can I connect this to other systems, right? As long as we can get at the data, we can put it in the format we need and we can go do the hard work. But do we support those APIs and those standards by default? How much work can we save ourselves if we're out there looking for systems that are already being built with the intention of letting someone programmatically interact with it, push data in, pull data out, so that we can use the best system for each one of these things? And I think that's what you're going to see, and you're seeing it all over the place today across some of the large authoring tool vendors who are launching LMSs to go next alongside them. We're seeing HCMSs and things like that need to hook to LMSs or try to embed an LMS. It's becoming more and more necessary for people to sort of tie all of these systems together. And XAPI is certainly one of your tools to do this, but we think there are a lot of other tools too that are being developed, new ways of approaching all of this. And we think that the only way we're going to find the best answer to some of these things is to continue to have questions from folks who have real problems they want to solve and try to help them solve their problems so they can go get work done.
Yep. And speaking of having questions, things that they want to solve, I would recommend folks take advantage of that question box. Since we have TJ on today, Rustici they are the XAPI experts, and if you have any questions about how it works or what it does, go ahead and ask those. And there were a couple of questions that came in as I leave the takeaways up here for people to reflect on. So one of the first questions that came in, TJ, so regarding data, what strategies can you recommend where the learning ecosystem is made up from various SaaS tools where they have no control over things like field names, et cetera, within the data stored in the various systems? So I know we talked a little bit about that as you went through the Caterpillar example, but you know, what do you think about that? Because that's what I was sort of describing is, you know, companies go out and buy these SaaS tools where it's not installed behind the firewall. They don't really have control over what's under the hood. How do they manage that from a data standpoint?
So I think you have two big hurdles that you've got to get over. One, and I think this one's the easier one, is does the SaaS tool you want to use offer you APIs that you can tie back into the rest of your system? That's the first one. And the second one is going to be bringing a developer into play. We're constantly interacting with small, mid-size, and large learning departments, and often until we get to some of the large learning departments, we see a lot of teams that don't have access to a developer to do software development work and tie these APIs together. And it's becoming increasingly more clear that the expanded complex ecosystem of tools and systems will require the learning department to have software development expertise to tie them together. It's not avoidable anymore. It is what's going to be necessary. And there are a lot of people we work with who are trying to build tools to make this more approachable and easier to get at. But the answer is really that, you know, in all the projects we've worked on like that, which have been several, those teams are bringing to bear a set of developers who pull that data out, know how to look up learner information in the centralized HR system, know how to recreate a version of that data that matches XAPI. They have a developer on staff doing that work. And that's the only path I see for that right now.
Yeah, you know, and you bring up a great point. It's something that we bring up quite a bit when we talk about sort of the future of L&D. You know, it isn't always going to be a technology solution. Clearly, there's going to be technologies that help us do these things. And you mentioned a lot of the technology providers are focused on how do we create tools that allow, like, say, someone who isn't a developer or an instructional systems designer create content. How do we put, you know, they're basically trying to democratize the tools so that you don't need a lot of these skills. But at the same time, we're seeing it's inevitable that L&D has to embrace the fact that it needs certain skill sets, either within learning or at least available to them as a shared service in the organization. Things like, you know, user experience designers, web designers, data scientists or data analysts are going to be critical. So a lot of these things, it's you know, like you said, TJ, it's the reality that learning has to recognize that some of these skills are going to have to come in under the purview of learning to get a lot of these things done. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and you know, I recently had the opportunity to work with an IEEE group who's sort of investigating what a learning engineer looks like in the future. What do we expect someone whose job is to help an organization build, deploy, manage, monitor, measure training? What are the skills they need? And you know, it became a big list fast. And I personally think that's probably these sort of multifaceted teams with different people and expertises. But there are going to be folks out there that end up becoming the sort of renaissance person of skills that are needed in the learning field too.
Right, and I think that's important. Like, so something like a user experience designer, someone who has that skill set that doesn't come at it from learning, I think is beneficial. Somebody who understands what actual pure user experience is outside of just learner experience, which those things are slightly different. And I think sometimes learning professionals don't see the full picture of what a user experience is. And same thing with data, you know, is that someone who can sort of look at the data in a pure sense, as opposed to thinking of it from the learning perspective, can be helpful as well. Another question that came in, this is a great one for you, TJ, is how do you reconcile the differing XAPI maturity levels across the multiple platforms that are providing that data to the LRS?
Yeah, so we have a couple of tools that we've built to help with this. I'll give an example of one of the things that we've done. So we work with a lot of folks who want to go do new, interesting, exciting things in their learning platform. And they say, but we're stuck on insert the name of whatever LMS it is that you're stuck on, and it doesn't offer us these capabilities, but they tell us it'll be there in 24 months. It's that story. So we've developed tools to help people build and manage something like an XAPI course in a separate tool, but still make it available to their LMS so that they can ingest it. So we have a number of tools we've built because this isn't a new problem. It's just a more pronounced problem today of helping people figure out how they're going to go build content and training in new technologies, but still play it and use it inside their old LMS. So, something like if you've ever used our SCORM Cloud or the Dispatch product or Content Controller that are really intended for helping people build content that can cross the learning standard aisle, as it were, making XAPI content look like SCORM content to an LMS that only supports SCORM, things like that. Past that, I think there's another thing to be concerned about when it comes to XAPI maturity. If you've watched any of the XAPI space, there's this push towards something called profiles, and it's really trying to help organizations, vendors, learning designers get to the point where we're all talking about the same things in the same way when it comes to XAPI. I'll give you just my really cheesy example that I always love, sometimes gets a laugh. XAPI is based on this idea of verbs. Every time a learner does something, we're going to capture the thing they did as a verb and say, TJ did this. So what if the thing we capture is that TJ fired Chris? That sounds great, but we don't actually know what it means. And that's my worry, is he might have fired Chris in a kiln, like a pot, out of a cannon, from his job. There's a lot of options. So even in the XAPI space, if we have an organization that's already using XAPI and they're doing it well, we're still often looking at places where we're seeing very different maturity models in those two organizations. And at our biggest organizations across the DoD, really large Fortune 100 manufacturing organizations, we've actually had to go in and do the work of helping them build the specification for how XAPI gets used in their organization. They then get to take that, supply it to their vendors, supply it to the software developers, supply it to the learning designers, supply it to the analyst team that builds the reports from the data. That way, everyone is already in agreement about what the data looks like and what we're going to be capturing. And that's been hugely helpful.
That's great. I appreciate that insight for sure. Okay, so here's a question that came in from Philip. Do you have any idea of the sort of the project scope to centrally manage content? So who's involved, what tools, how long it typically takes?
I think that's going to depend a lot on your particular project and where you're headed. We've certainly worked with organizations who have realized they had this problem and were able to go manage it on their own. If customers are procuring something from us, that might take as little as a week for us to get them started in an environment where they can go start trying that out. And we have some organizations who want to centrally manage content out to systems that look a lot more like an application that their developers need to manage. And then we have tools that we can sell and help them integrate into their product that might take longer, 4, 5, 6 weeks. But really, that's really going to depend a lot on a particular organization and what their content looks like. Is it all in the same standard? Is it standardized at all? But those are the kinds of projects that we like to help people explore and think through.
Yeah, and just from my experience in dealing with organizations, I think one of the first steps that companies will take in pursuit of that specific question is they'll see what they have internally that can sort of solve the problem for them right away. And it typically is something like a SharePoint. And like, oh, we've got a repository, and it doesn't care what format anything is in, and we can just put it all there and everyone will know where it is, and then it all goes there and that's where it dies because no one can find it. No one knows how to work with it. It's not generating the right kind of data. And what ends up happening is you're actually creating another layer to the problem you originally had that you're going to have to unwind and solve. And so, when you want to go down this road, you talk about this idea of this project, definitely think about it as far as the scope goes, because typically I've seen that these sort of workarounds, they don't work. And they create more challenges than they are meant to solve. So definitely you give that some strong thought because there's a lot of pressure. I know this from inside organizations too. Well, can't you use what we already have? And so, do the due diligence, but you also want to maybe be able to demonstrate why that's maybe not the best solution for this challenge. So that's just some food for thought there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and as Amy sort of following up with what I just said, is that buy-in challenge with those that hold the purse strings, right? And so don't get too technical on them, but help them understand the scope of the challenge precisely. Like, and that's the thing when they're talking about dollars, right? There's a good chance that you're not going to be able to respond in dollars, but what you can respond with is things that impact the business, like how long it's going to take you to do things, the amount of rework and duplication that's going to come from not having the systems in place to do this. Going back to the data and using tools to collect and manage that. Saying that, look, we have no insight into what we're doing. I can't even tell you how effective we are because we don't have the tools that can tell me this. Those are the things that you're trying to do. So yes, trying to get them to understand the scope of the challenge and that you need the right tools to get through it, for sure. Let's see, one more question here as we're winding down to the top of the hour. So what approaches can you recommend for those of us, and Richard's saying he suspects many of the folks on the line who have a huge amount of non-XAPI legacy content, but still want to take advantage of an XAPI-centric ecosystem, but you're not really in a position to convert the older stuff. Are there any recommendations there? I'm sure you run into this all the time.
All the time. This is one of the most useful things that we enable people to do inside our platforms and tools in a few different ways. I'll call out the ways you can do it with our platforms. There are a few other ways that I'll mention too. In the tooling that Rustici Software sells, we're going to look back at that content controller product. It'll let you put that SCORM content or XAPI content into this application, and it's going to be the thing that really knows how to handle and talk about XAPI. But then what's going to be able to happen is that you're going to export out of this content controller application a SCORM package that you can take to your LMS that only operates on SCORM. Your LMS is going to get back all of the normal SCORM feedback and results that you would expect from a SCORM course, but all of the extra stuff that you decided to track. If you wanted to know, how do people interact with module 2 in this course? Is it a good module? Does it confuse people? Whatever data you needed to capture there will actually be stored inside that content controller application that's helping you bridge that standards gap. And now you can go look at all of that data and start taking advantage of XAPI immediately. On the other side, we have customers who might use something like Content Controller or our engine product in their LMS in a way that lets them take something that is SCORM, give it to their learners, but then get the data back out as XAPI so that they can do that work of making sure all of the results data is in the same format. So they're able to then start tying it to that outcome data, even though they're only looking at data from SCORM. And this is something that we've been able to do with Watershed and a number of their customers, working with different tools we provide. So Watershed is that LRS analytics tool. It can provide a dashboard and show you answers to these meaningful questions that you want to make some decisions on. These are the actionable questions for your organization. But to do that, they need a lot of data, and some of that data is actually in SCORM courses. So they're able to make it available via Content Controller, the SCORM Cloud Dispatch tool, and both of those tools will actually take all the SCORM data, translate it over to XAPI data, and then push it out into other parts of your ecosystem so that you can have it live right alongside all your other data. And that's really going to make it a lot easier to export all of this learning data out of your system into a way that you can work on inside Tableau, inside any of these analytics tools, or inside something like Watershed, so that you can put it alongside all the other data. That would be my best recommendation. Outside of that, there are also a few wrappers that you can find on GitHub that will do the work of helping make something like an XAPI course look a little like a SCORM course in the browser and vice versa. So there are a couple open source tools. We have some commercial tools that are larger applications that help if you have a large problem, if you have 1,000 courses, whereas some of those open source tools are going to be more applicable if you have 1, 2, 3 courses. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's all. Thank you so much, TJ, for addressing that. I appreciate that. And that brings us to the top of the hour. So I would like to thank TJ definitely for joining me today and providing all of that insight. It's been fascinating to watch the evolution of XAPI over the years and things that you guys are doing. And of course, thanks to Rustici for providing this forum for us today and providing you to us. Thank you very much. And of course, thanks to those of you who attended. I appreciate your participation in the polls and all the questions. That's been great. I hope you got the answers you were looking for. As always, you can reach out to us here at Brandon Hall Group, success@brandonhall.com if you have any further questions. And don't forget, a link to the recording as well as the PDF will go out in an email within the next day or so. And while there's still time, you can grab the handout from the control panel right now if you like. But again, thanks to everybody, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. Thanks, TJ.
Yeah, thank you so much, David.